Welcome to the Dakota Housing Network. I'm the co-host, Joe Sheehan, and today we have with us here Senator Heitkamp from the great state of North Dakota and the Director, Richard Cordray, from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And how are you, Senator Heitkamp?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having us on.
Well, you recently were able to coordinate a trip to North Dakota and bring maybe the most powerful person in financial regulation in the world to North Dakota. How were you able to do that? Why did you do that? What was the point of the trip to North Dakota with Director Cordray?
Well, it didn't take a lot of work because Director Cordray, I think, really wants to hear from people on the ground. I think a lot of times he spends time sitting in the hot seat at committee hearings, but that's not where the most amount of information can get gleaned or learned. And so we extended the invitation for Director Cordray to come out and meet directly with community bankers to hear their concerns, to actually have a dialogue and not have a series of gotchas, but actually talk about this from a very real and practical sense. And I think all of the people who attended both the banker/credit union meeting and the auto dealers were extraordinarily grateful that Director Cordray came out and actually sat down and heard their concerns. We're going to advance some of the ideas, and hopefully we'll be able to see progress being made in terms of continuing the dialogue between regulators and these institutions that are so critical to rural America.
Clearly, you brought him out here to have that conversation. What were you hoping would be the outcome for North Dakota and Director Cordray at the end of the conversation?
Well, I was hoping a prioritization because so often when we're dealing here with concerns about regulation, all we hear is overregulation, and that really is not helpful to talk in generalities. I wanted to get down to very specific examples, very direct, kind of how will this impact my business and what's the rationale behind this. I'm not saying that we had a meeting of the minds, but we had a conversation, which is more than what you can frequently have in Washington, D.C.
Director Cordray, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Glad to be with you.
How much Coogan and Nefla soup did Senator Heitkamp have to bargain with to get you to come to North Dakota?
Well, it wasn't difficult because Senator Heitkamp is somebody I consider to be a practical problem solver. She's somebody I greatly respect. She and I both had served at one time or another as attorney generals of our state. When she said that it would be great for me to come and have a chance to sit down with bankers, credit union leaders, and auto dealers in particular in North Dakota, I was glad to have the chance to do it. It's just a matter of arranging the schedules, and we learned a lot while we were there.
Senator Heitkamp, as you watch the community bankers and car dealerships and engage Director Cordray, what did you learn? What surprised you in the trip out here?
I don't know that anything really surprised me. I think that that day that we had the meeting, there was a report talking about the difficulty of banks under $100 million. There were well-represented banks there under $100 million, and that's kind of the pressure point. I think it was also an opportunity to try and figure out how the Bank of North Dakota is playing a role to bridge some of these concerns. And I think for the bankers, it was a way to look someone in the eye who, in many ways has been, people say, well, he doesn't care, or that's not, we're regulating with a big brushstroke and say, these are our concerns, can you help us? And to have, I think, a fair amount of sympathy being exchanged about how difficult it is to maintain compliance in banks that size, and what we can do to be more sympathetic, particularly in the rural areas where those relationship banking, that relationship banking history has been so critical to the development of our rural communities. And so I think one of the things that drives me crazy in this town is that it's all about that 20-second soundbite or that, spot on the news where it's all about controversy instead of dialogue. And this was really an opportunity for people to, number one, meet the person, but also to have a meaningful, I think, dialogue on what those challenges are.
Director Cordray, as you had the conversation with folks here in North Dakota, what were the messages you took away, and what messages do you feel like you conveyed back to the community bankers and people in finance that you met with?
So the first thing I would say, I agree with the senator. It's very different to be able to sit down and have a conversation over 60 or 90 minutes as opposed to the kind of staccato back and forth we often run into in Washington. And to hear people tell their stories about what it means to lend in rural areas without a lot of wherewithal, and to hear the way they tell it and exactly what their challenges are, is the kind of thing that can't help but affect your thinking. And one of the things I'm well aware of, and it was reinforced during the trip to North Dakota, is there are so many small towns and small collections of residents who depend enormously on their local community bank in order to have a functioning economy, in order to have business lending, in order to be able to get mortgages, and there really is no substitute for that. So whatever we can be doing to think about tailoring our rules and regulations such that we can recognize the situation of community banks that did not cause the financial crisis, that typically lend in a more responsible way with low defaults and that look out and try to work things out for their customers, that's an important message for us to hear, and to hear exactly the way people say it as they're telling the story of their own institutions.
And so what were you able to tell them in terms of how your agency is actually going to be able to support them being able to act and be that conduit and stimulus in those communities to keep those economies alive and thriving?
So I think one important thing is many of them engage in mortgage lending, and that's been a focus of work by the Consumer Bureau, and we have learned to tailor our rules so that there are special provisions for smaller creditors, most of which were the types of bankers and credit union officials I was hearing from in that room. We have revised our definition of what is a rural loan, not once, not twice, but now 3 times, and the last time was in partnership with the Congress to make changes that now makes a state like North Dakota virtually entirely rural and gives people the ability to make loans, keep them in portfolio. They don't have to worry about various aspects of our rules. They don't have to take on compliance burden at the same level we expect the larger institutions to do. All of that was reinforced on the visit and is part of the kind of input we are seeking in order to know how to go about our job and do it better.
One of the things I know when I talk to other community bankers as well is that even though you may write rules that exempt the small community banks from it, when they want to participate in the secondary services offered where they're dependent on the larger banks, it's the larger banks that often make them have to comply with the rules. So even though they wouldn't have to maybe take on the expense to do that 10-year in-house mortgage, if they want to try to help and offer the services of like the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, they are still up against the challenge of the expense to maintain the criteria to stay up with the regulatory requirements because the larger banks they're selling those services off to require it. Did you get into that? Were you able to address those concerns at all?
So I don't know why larger banks would necessarily feel compelled to require that. We have written our rules in ways that create special provisions for smaller creditors. We intend those to be the provisions that apply to these smaller community banks and credit unions. And larger banks don't need to impose any further criteria beyond those. But I will tell you one thing I did hear, and it was unique in North Dakota, was what it means to have a state bank of North Dakota as you have there. It's the only state in the union that has a state-run bank. It is not a bank that competes with the smaller community banks, but it's a bank that actually helps and supports them and often does buy mortgages from them once they have made them and completed them. That struck me as enormously valuable, and it was interesting to see what a collaborative relationship had developed over the last 90 years, 100 years between the State Bank of North Dakota and these smaller community banks and credit unions as well.
Yeah, it definitely helps strengthen it's like a backbone to the state, it seems, and I hear a lot of positive feedback about it as well.
If I can add, just
absolutely,
I think
Senator.
it's incumbent on us to make sure that everybody understands what the rules are, and that if someone says, no, I can't do this because of this, in the example you just gave, we can't take these and put them into the secondary market because you haven't done the compliance that would have been required by a large bank. It's really important that we have that communication. Say that's not necessarily true. That may be something internal to that large bank organization, but that's not a regulatory requirement. And so we don't want to create a situation where we're opening up the financial markets to the kind of shenanigans that happened in 2008. But by the same token, we want things to be value added, not just regulation for regulation's sake and not one size fits all. And we've been at the kinds of differentiation between the small community banks and the larger banks. One of the things that I repeatedly I repeat consistently to the community banks and the credit unions is that, don't be the stalking horse for the large institutions. Don't be out there arguing things that are only significant to them. Let's make sure that we have those delineations. And you see that as kind of I wouldn't say a chronic problem, but we constantly have to roll back and say, wait a minute, does that mean, this is the difference between how you're regulated and how, let's say, an institution over $1 billion or $10 billion would be regulated, and let's not distort that line. And I think sometimes it's in larger institutions to distort that line because there's great sympathy in Washington to the plight of the independent community banks. And so the constant job that we have is to constantly remind people that may not be a problem for a small community bank.
Yeah, and it's good to hear that community banks need to maybe have conversations and that there's support for those delineations in terms of regulatory requirements. That certainly could be helpful down the road. As one last question here as we run the last couple minutes, and then I'll for Director Cordray, and then I'll let you wrap it up, Senator Heitkamp. But real quick, did you get into one of the things when I'm meeting with community bankers all over is the fear of the CFPB. And Director Cordray, did you get a chance to talk about whether or not they should or shouldn't be afraid of the CFPB?
We did, and that's one of the reasons why I thought this visit was so valuable, and I was appreciative of Senator Heitkamp bringing us out to North Dakota so we could sit down face to face. Now, we also often have the bankers, they'll come to Washington to talk to their members of Congress and their senators. And when they do, we always invite them to come talk to us as well. Again, there's no substitute for that face-to-face discussion. And I think that if they can understand better what we're trying to do, that we don't always think we know all the right answers, that we're trying to understand, we're trying to tailor our rules for smaller institutions, particularly in rural areas where lending is clearly a more difficult and a more burdensome thing than in densely populated areas. Those are exactly the kinds of things we should know, and it's the kind of learning that we should take back to the job we're doing. And I would like to think that the chance to sit down and talk back and forth and ask each other questions and hear from each other's point of view both help us understand one another and should reduce that anxiety that people have about anything new or anything that seems potentially different.
Well, we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Senator Heitkamp, your last word.
Well, the last word is that we aren't going to fix things, entirely with one meeting, but to simply open up the dialogue and say, please understand. And I think sometimes people who are working really, really hard on community development, which a lot of our community banks think, if I only get a chance to explain what I'm doing, and I find that these kinds of visits are so critical, whether it's bringing out the Postmaster General or whether it's bringing out the head of the FDIC, to actually create a human relationship as opposed to kind of the big bad regulator and the big bad banks. None of that really solves the problems that we're in, and none of us want to see a repeat of what happened in 2008, but we also want and understand the need for credit and the need for financing, especially home mortgage financing. And so it'll continue to be a huge priority for us to keep these smaller institutions in the mortgage lending business.
Well, Director Cordray and Senator Heitkamp, we greatly appreciate you coming on the Dakota Housing Network and talking about the visit to North Dakota and the commitment to solving problems and especially serving the rural areas and keeping them strong and robust. Thank you again for coming on the show, and thank you for tuning in to the Dakota Housing Network.